so. Okay, my fault. Okay, I'm sorry for the interruption.
Privileged now to write this up in a little book for lay people called The Cross and the Prodigal, and it's written up also for scholars in a more extended work called Poet and Peasant. Let us try to look at just the high points of what my 25-year love affair has brought to me. Let's look at the story as we find it in a story about the Middle Easterners themselves, talking as Jesus was as a fellow Middle Easterner to his fellow Middle Easterners. The first thing we start off with is that in the beginning, a young man requests his inheritance while his father is still alive. Now, I don't know what age you are and whether or not your parents are still alive. My saintly mother died 2 years ago, and when she was still alive, I did not say to her, "Look, Mom, you're getting old. I'd like a new car. Dad left a few bonds. Why don't you give them to me now? I'm going to get them pretty soon anyway. You're going to kick off before too long." I didn't say that to my saintly mother. I very much doubt if you have said anything of that kind to your parents. Because in the Middle East, and surely this is true for, in some sense, for every culture anywhere in the world, to ask such a question means, "Dad, why don't you drop dead?" Now, in the Middle East, this is so specific and it is so intently felt that for 25 years I have looked for a story like this in the culture of the Middle East, and I've not found one. We don't find anything like it in the Old Testament, Intertestament literature, early Jewish or Syriac literature, Arabic literature. I've tried all of it. I have never found in oral or in written fashion any story like this. This bomb which goes off at the beginning is so horrifying that nobody tells a story like this except Jesus of Nazareth. What is he? I did find 2 cases of people who had experienced this. One was a Syrian farmer in which the older son walked in on his father and said, "I want my share of the family farm." And the father took his right hand and he struck the boy across the face with his hand, the back of the hand, which is an even worse insult, and drove him out of the house. And it took 5 years before the other brothers could reconcile the son again to the father. Another case I found was of a Jewish Christian in Tehran who was a physician, medical doctor. And one night, the wife called up the pastor, who was my student, saying, "Please hurry over. Our son wants his father to die." The pastor rushed over. "What happened? Has there been a big fight? Did he pull a gun on you?" "No." He came in and asked for his inheritance. The father tried to say to the physician, "Look, it's a different age. These young people don't think the way we do. I'm sure he doesn't mean it that way. You mustn't be upset." The father was adamant. "My son wants me to die." 3 months later, the father, in previously good health, died of a heart attack, and the wife said he died that night, the night the boy came in and said, "Where is my inheritance?" So how does this story begin? It begins with this enormously explosive bomb in which we are told that man in his sin, not God, is dead, but rather man wants God to be dead, wants God to be non-existent, to have no authority over us. This is deep within the nature of our sin. We want no power with final authority over us. Now, the story is supposed to explode. The father is supposed to be angry. He's supposed to insult his son and drive him out of the house. Of course, there's no way in which he's going to grant this request. And immediately, the son is supposed to be the Kissinger or the Philippe Habib. He's supposed to start the shuttle diplomacy. And
Okay. When he says the son, he means the elder son. He left that out. So let me clarify that. So this is what he's saying. If the people listening to this had heard this huge, horrible affront, this is what they would expect to happen. The father would insult him, drive him out of the house. never grant the request, and the elder brother is supposed to take the role of talking sense into the younger one and reconciling the two together.
He's supposed to rush between capitals and try to make peace. He's supposed to go into his father and say, look, Dad, the kid's barely out of diapers. Don't take him seriously. I'm sure he doesn't mean it. Then he goes to his brother and says, no way, we're never going to accept this. Now you've got to apologize. You've got to go back and tell your father that you're sorry. And then finally, they manage to make peace. There's a big party. They embrace one another, and it's all over. This is what's supposed to happen. It doesn't. From the very beginning of the story, we know exactly what all three of these characters are like. We know what the younger son is like by what he does, what he asks for, We know what the older son is like by what he does not do. He refuses to be the reconciler. And we know what the father is like by what he grants. Now, according to first century Jewish law, a father, if he was...
Okay, let's pause.
Just a clarification. Okay, when I read it, the father had split, the younger son wanted his inheritance, but it says that, so the father divided his property between the two sons.
Yes.
Did the older son at that time say, Father, don't worry about my part?
Gold star.
It is still yours. It is still yours.
Gold star. So what Nancy is foreshadowing here is if the younger son asks for his inheritance, the story says, against all expectations, the father, and what we learn about the father, he granted the request and divided the property between them. What do we hear from the older son? Not a peep. All right, so you wait till you hear what Ken says. Also notice the allegorical piece of interpreting this parable is one level of interpretation. That was what the Muslims were doing, what the Christians were doing. They agreed that the younger son represents sinful humanity. The father represents God. So those are allegorical pieces that are accepted in one level of interpretation of this. All right, so sinful humanity wants God out of the picture. We don't want final authority over us. That's what the theology behind this is. And so it's put into an allegorical situation of a sinful younger son saying to his father, you're as good as dead to me, give me my stuff and I'm going to go on my way and do things how I want. And this is the conundrum, the fallenness of sinful humanity. It's not all of the picture, but that's really important to know that even the Muslims agree on that this is an allegory that talks about sinful humanity falling away, breaching their relationship with God the Father, and what's going to happen after that.
So he was saying that the older son, and he mentioned Kissinger, et cetera, as a negotiator.
Yes.
He failed to be a person to step up to
Exactly.
say, wait a minute, what are you doing here? So he is still, he's representing God at that point, or representing
he's representing
the humanity?
Well, he's not representing what he should have done is be the reconciler.
Okay.
All right, so there's a reconciliation.
But then he's part of the sinful humanity if he accepted the part of the inheritance too.
And what are the two divisions that Ken is arguing of sinful humanity? Sinners who break the law and sinners who keep the law. And the sinners who keep the law sometimes are in a harder position because they think, well, I don't need any help. I'm already righteous. And here's what the older brother, and all right, and so now I'll preview why I told you the story about Nathan the prophet. Jesus was, his audience in this was who? In telling the story of the parable of the lost younger son and the lost older son, do we remember who his audience was at this point? Okay, it's the Pharisees. Right, he's speaking to those people. So in my estimation, Jesus is doing to the Pharisees what the prophet Nathan did to David. I can't come at you with a straightforward argument. I first have to draw you in and see the logic of it, and then you can see it. So Jesus brilliantly is telling this story and drawing the Pharisees and the scribes in. And they're even going to get to a point in this and say, wait a minute, Jesus knows what's right here. The son is supposed to come and be contrite. He's supposed to have a plan to repay everything. You understand the old definition of repentance or the other definition of, and the Pharisees. So Jesus is drawing the Pharisees in just like Nathan drew in David. And then at the end, he's going to say, you are the older brother. All right. So hopefully that gives an idea of how intricately brilliant and how in the tradition of prophets, Jesus was telling this story.
So you said that the older son and the younger son both represented the sinful humanity, but one was the sinners keep the law and one is sinners break the law.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's second base in the,
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And now we find out, just like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the priest passed by and didn't do what he could have done. The scribe passed by and didn't do it, and the thieves had done what they shouldn't have done. And the Samaritan made up for what the thieves did and what the priest could have done. So now we're seeing the son has done something horrible. The elder brother has not played the role of reconciler, so that role is glaringly missing. So all of this now, you can try and look and see, anticipate where is that going to be made up in the story? If the elder brother's not going to do it, if the son owes a debt, how is that going to be made right? Okay.
Wasn't under pressure. He's under pressure.
Okay, I got it. We'll miss part of this. He's talking about in the Middle East how you can make a will verbally. It's accepted to do so with witnesses if the father is not under pressure. All right. If there's some pressure, somebody being held hostage, his verbal will can't be binding. But if he's freely deciding, okay, and as you said, the father inexplicably says, okay, I will divide it between them. So he makes his will known, and how it's executed has to do with, the father's still alive, so Ken will try and fill that in for us. So, but he's not under any pressure.
Pressure, it doesn't count. But if he's not under pressure, he can make an oral will. He can say, okay, boys, when I'm gone, you get this and you get this. And according to Jewish law, the older son got 2/3, the younger son got 1/3. Oh. But if he made that oral will, the sons do not take possession, and thereby they can't sell until he's gone. The father still has authority over the estate, and he has the right of the profits. So if it's an agricultural farm, the produce of the farm belongs to the father, which he can use and spend and give away as he likes. If at the end of the year there are profits which he has not spent, they become a part of the capital, and he cannot spend it. And that's a part of the background of the story, which every listener to the story would have understood and becomes critical, particularly at the end. All right, so this young man not only presses that there might be a division, that he might be given his share, he presses for the right to sell, which is the second unheard of, horrifying request. And indeed, as William Temple, the famous Archbishop of Canterbury, has said, God grants freedom to man, even the freedom to reject his love, the freedom to reject the love of God. And there is no pain more intense than the agony of rejected love, in which the lover reaches out in love, and that love is rejected. And in that rejection, there is the deepest suffering of the human spirit. The cross, the deepest pain of the cross, was not the 6 hours of torture. Many, many people in Hitler's torture chambers experienced physical pain far more, far longer, and thereby far more excruciatingly painful than the cross. The pain of the cross, not discounting its physical side, but the real pain of the cross was the agony of rejected love. This love the Father experiences from the very beginning of that story, and it is, mind you, the path on which the Son will have to walk if he is going to come home. And without that path, there is no possibility of his considering returning. The father, if he likes, can have a mock funeral, which sometimes people do in the Middle East, bury an empty box and say to himself, I no longer have a son. If he does this, there's no way in which the boy can return. All right. So the father grants this request and he divides the living between them. The older boy gets his share assigned to him, and presumably it's the rest of the estate. He should have spoken up and said, no, Dad, may you live 100 years. I don't want it now. But he's quiet. And we know a great deal about him from the beginning of the story. So then the next thing we're told is that after not many days, the younger son, and the old translation was gathered together all that he had. We now know that this particular Greek verb was a verb that bankers use and means realized. It means turned into cash. He's not given his inheritance in so many stocks and bonds in a safety deposit box. It's not a sack of coins. He's given the title deeds to property. This he has to sell. He has to realize it. He can't take it with him unless he sells it. So we're told he does this in a hurry. Now, how come in a hurry? Well, in the Middle East, the sale of property is a long and very drawn-out affair. You spend months and sometimes years over the disposal of property. This fellow does it in a hurry. Why? Because the village is mad at him. Okay, someone will buy. That's true. But as a community, they're very, very unhappy with him. And every home he goes to and says, I've got the South 40 for sale, the answer thrown in his face is, what? You're going to sell the orchard that your grandfather planted? What's the matter with you, kid? Don't you know you're selling your own soul? What has happened to you? What is your father going to do? This is his old age pension. And on the conversation will go. So he's got to do it in a hurry and get out of there because the heat in the village is intensifying day after day, and he's got to settle at any price and get out, which he does. So he goes into the far country, and then we're told that he wastes his money in expensive living. The words in Greek have no hint of immorality. Hollywood has tried to tell us that he spent that money in an immoral fashion. His brother, at the end of the story, has some ideas about this, but the text itself does not say he spent it in an immoral fashion. It merely says he wasted his money in expensive living.
Interesting point. How many of us just assumed that the brother was right? Well, he spent it on harlots. He gambled. It was all immoral. And Ken's saying intentionally, the story says expensive living. Okay, so he was unwise. He made bad investments. Doesn't say anything about he was immoral. The brother accuses him of that. A subtle piece that says sinners who keep the law oftentimes look at sinners who break the law and then impose their thoughts on what the nature of their sin is, and do so ignorantly and convincingly, even though it may or may not be true. So that's an interesting point that he brings out. The other piece that Ken's going to come up with now, you hear the anger in the village is growing. Everybody would have known about the request by now and what was happening, and that the father has granted this, and everybody's in turmoil about it. And the son realizes by selling, takes the cash, heads away. Now, if he goes and invests it and comes back like the Count of Monte Cristo, I have more than quadrupled what and I'm coming back and now I can come back and help my father in he could come back successful. Right? So that is not yet determined. Now, Ken's going to talk about how the people in the village, once they hear this story, start plotting a ceremony called the kizaza. And he'll say this over and over again. It's like the Amish shun. When you have crossed the line, the whole community turned their back on you. Right? They don't enact it because there still is the possibility that he could come back and having made good on everything, but they suspect not. But it's only when he returns that he's in danger of this ceremony.
And it's important for,
Go ahead.
Sure. I was just curious. So I never knew that the older one got 2/3 and the younger one got 1/3. So when the younger son came back, was the older son maybe concerned that if the father is going to give him some of that, it means instead of giving 2/3, he's taking his 2/3
Yep.
and now it's breaking down and he
Exactly. Now you've not only squandered what was yours, if you come back, you're going to start taking away from what's mine. Exactly. And we learned from Jacob and Esau, the birthright of the firstborn was very important, not only for the property, but for the authority, for the blessing, and to give up that birthright. And that's the interesting thing about the Bible, where the elder ends up serving the younger.
So how does that tie into coming to God to get God's love and redemption? And is it saying that part of humanity is saying, I've been faithful to you, God, and here's these people that are claiming that sin, and they're going to be loved more than I am, who has been here all the time?
If you take the story as it is, all of that is emphasizing the stuff, the riches, the earthly riches. And what we're going to find out is, and what the younger son will find out is, it was never about the money. It was about drop dead, Dad. And that relationship was breached, but now it's restored. The money, however it shook out, wasn't the important thing after all. It was the relationship. So that's where we're coming to. And I had a point, but it left me, so it'll come back sometime. So so there's so much written into this. I know what the point was. Think of a Native American chief. All right? The elder son oftentimes was the one who would become the next chief. Therefore, would receive the lion's share of the inheritance, not just because he's privileged. He was responsible for the clan and for the tribe. So he needed the wherewithal to carry out his responsibility. In that culture, the father was the one through whom you had all of your security and all of your protection, all of your sustenance. That the patriarch of the clan, not just the father, could be a great-grandfather. That's how their society worked. It's one of the reasons why when Jesus talks to God as Father, it's not to say, well, God's a male. It's to say he represents that culture's understanding of the patriarch who is responsible for my safety, my security, everything I am. So the elder brother would receive 2/3, and we think, well, that's not fair in the way we do things. But in the way they did things, he was going to accept the responsibility of becoming responsible for the clan and the tribe. Therefore, he got the wherewithal to do so. In fact, if there were more than 2 sons, the elder gets 2/3 and the rest split the other third. So,
What was that Kasaza ceremony you were talking about?
he's going to get into it
Okay.
in depth here with, and it will seem very tribal, but remnants of that still exist today.
Division of property.
It's more than that. It is the community saying, you have gone so far as to be, you're as good as dead to us. And they will enact things like breaking pots. And there's some funny stories about how that still manifests itself today that he'll say. So yeah, the kizaza is like the Amish shun. Once you've crossed the line. Now in the Amish community, if you own property, you could at least work your own sustenance. Nobody would have anything to do with you, but you could still live on your property and farm your farm. In this, you can't even set foot in the village. So.
for us to note that. All right? Sooner or later, the money is all gone. So now what's he going to do? Well, the obvious thing is he should pack up and go home. But you see, now he's embarrassed. He's embarrassed and he's afraid. Now, what's he afraid of? Well, the first thing he's afraid of is he is ashamed before his father because the father gave him the property and now he's lost it. And second, he's afraid of his brother because if he goes home, he will be eating off of the rest of the estate, which has now been legally signed over as the property of his brother. And that which he eats is a part of that which the father has the right to distribute, which if he did not distribute, by the end of the year would be added to the capital, and thereby added to the capital which his brother will one day inherit. And his brother will have some very choice remarks to make to him at practically every meal. We know from the story itself that they were not in good relationships at the beginning. Had they been in good relationships, his brother would have accepted to be the subtle diplomacy and would have gone back and forth and made reconciliation. Now he's going to go back, and every meal his brother's going to say, "You dirty so-and-so, you took yours, and now you're coming back to eat off of mine." All right, but that's not his worst problem. His deepest problem is the fact that the village is probably going to enact a traditional ceremony. We know from the Talmud that in first century Palestine, the Jews had a very special ceremony across the countryside that was called the Kizaza ceremony. And Kizaza cognates with Arabic Qisasa, which means the punishment ceremony. And this ceremony was if you were a Jew living in a Jewish village, and if you did one of two things, if you lost the family property to the Gentiles, or if you married an immoral woman, and if you dared show your face back in your home village, they would get a huge earthenware pot and fill it with burned nuts and burned corn, and they would break it in front of you, and they would all cry out, "So-and-so is cut off from his people." Now, we know he's amongst the Gentiles because these people are keeping pigs. And Jews obviously did not keep pigs. He's probably in a Greek city, or that's probably the image that would be quickly conjured up in the minds of Jesus' audience. And so he has now broken one of the two requirements on the basis of which, if he comes back, the Kisasa ceremony is going to be enacted. This is kind of like the Amish Dutch shun of Pennsylvania. If you know that community, they have a way of keeping people in line. If you break the rules of the community, then they invoke the shun, which means no one will talk to you, no one will give you a drink, no one will feed you, no one will hire you, no one will sell or buy from you. And as an Amishman, if you have land, it's kind of like solitary confinement out in the open, but at least you will be able to eat. This poor fellow is coming home with nothing, and that if they enact this ceremony, he's not even going to eat. Curiously, this of an earthenware pot, we still have it in the Middle East on two levels. And one is when you're trying to get rid of some neighbor that you just think is awful, after he leaves, then you say, "Let's break a pot," by which you mean, "I hope he never comes back." Or in the hospitals up in the mountains of Lebanon, the peasants who still preserve the customs of the ancient Middle East, when they go to leave the hospital, the last thing they do is to throw an earthenware drinking pot out of the window, and it goes crashing down on the sidewalk. I've had these things explode nearby. It's kind of a shock, but what they're saying is, "I hope I never get sick again, and I hope I never have to come back again to the hospital."
So there we go. We can adopt that, right? So when Jim Petrausch walks out of worship next, if you see me holding a great big pot, or if I'm in the hospital and I'm fed up with being sick, and when I finally get to go, just toss a pot out the window, hoping that it doesn't fall on the head of somebody else. But it makes me laugh that Ken said he's had pots explode nearby because they still do this. All right, so it's a light piece, but it shows that this lingering thing was very serious.
Yep.
These enactments of cut off from your people were deadly serious.
The breaking of a pot means total final separation. All right, they will probably, he thinks, enact this Kizaza ceremony if I go back to my village. Put it this way: do you Imagine yourself going back to the 25th anniversary of your graduating class if you're on relief. You know, I mean, if you could show up in a nice gray flannel suit and you've got a nice looking wife and she's well dressed and a pretty car sitting outside, and you can talk expansively about, well, yes, things are going fairly well down at the company, you're glad to go. But if you're a little bit shabby and you've got to walk and you're on relief and you don't have a job, you don't bother to go. My Lebanese friends tell me nobody goes back to his village having immigrated to the rest of the world unless he makes it. You want to show up and talk about how much money you've made and build yourself a nice little retirement stone villa there in the mountains to show off how successful you are. If you immigrated to Brazil and you didn't make it, then you'd better stay and beg in Brazil. It's too humiliating to go back and beg in your own village. But this fellow not only has gone off into the big wide world to make his fame and fortune and failed, he has offended the village, and he has broken relationships with his family, and he has broken his father's heart before he left. And now he's going to go back. Mind you, the issue is not the broken law. He hasn't broken any laws. The issue is the broken relationship. He has broken his father's heart on a very, very deep level by wanting his father to die. Okay, so this kid in the far country is ready to go and feed pigs because he can't face that return to the village. We know the story. Finally, he sees the pigs eating these pods and he says, boy, I wish I could eat that stuff. And he can't because his stomach won't take it. So finally, he decides, I'm going to go home. So when he does, what does he say? He prepares a wonderful speech. He says, I will go back to my father and I'll say I have sinned. Okay, there's his confession. And then I will say to him, fashion out of me a craftsman. We've translated this, make me into a hired servant. The word hired servant, misthos, is a different word from the ordinary word for a slave, which is doulos, or the diakonos, which is the house servant, the kinds of words that ordinarily we get. This is a special word. And Jewish scholarship has identified the fact that this word is the equivalent of the word skilled craftsman. And when he says make me, he's using the word which was used for God when God made the world. Fashion out of me a craftsman. What's the point? The point is, I'm still young and strong. Okay, I blew it. Don't worry, Dad. You train me as a good carpenter, and I will save my wages, and I will pay you back $1 at a time, and one of these years I'm going to have all that money paid back, and then everything is going to be square.
I'm sorry I broke the window. I will fix the broken window, whatever it takes. I won't break the window again. The Pharisees are like, yeah, that's how you're supposed to do it.
But you see, you and I know that the issue is not the money. The issue is, Dad, why don't you drop dead? Now, how much is he going to pay Dad to make up for the broken relationship? If it's a matter of a broken law, okay, he can pay money, but it isn't. It's a broken relationship. Now, how is this going to be restored? Today, I insult you in public, and tomorrow I say, Joe, how much shall I make out the check for because I'm sorry I insulted you yesterday? And the offer of a check is now a deeper insult. You are now rubbing salt into the wounds. We have broken a relationship with God, and we keep coming back and saying to him, how many brownie points do I have to earn? How many laws do I have to keep? How many services do I have to attend? And then the account is going to be square. And our very attempt to do this adds greater fuel to the insult.
Which is our mistaken view of our relationship with God as transactional. And boy, that's easy to fall into. God, I owe you, and so therefore, what do I have to do to pay my way back and make it square? Transactional relationship, not a loving relationship.
He doesn't understand this. In the far country, he's thinking as a Jew, and he's saying, I know what is required. I know I've got to confess, and I've got to offer how I'm going to make up for my sins. And of course, as a craftsman, he's an outsider. He will live in the village, and he will not live at home. And he doesn't think he's going to go home until the record is square. Now, at that point in the story, the Pharisees who are listening begin to applaud. And they begin to say to themselves, aha, this young rabbi, we thought he didn't understand, but we see he does. You see, Jesus did not say to them, now look, fellas, you can't be too hard on these sinners. They've had a hard life. Don't you think that we could be sympathetic? No. He says, you guys think sinners are bad. I think they're so bad, they're like a man who betrays his family, loses his property to the Gentiles, and ends up feeding pigs. That's what I think of him. Now, what's he got to do? Well, he's got to go through the Jewish repentance, says the story this far. And at that point, we find the Pharisaic audience jumping into the story and saying on a very deep level, hey, that's right. This young carpenter has really got the whole thing all together. He understands our theology very precisely. And that's exactly our complaint. The people whom he's welcoming are doing this. Okay, he understands. Now let's see how the story is going to come out. Okay, so now put yourself into the framework of the mentality of this young kid who is now starting home, and he's steeling his nerves for the entry into that village. The big houses of any Middle Eastern village are in the center for protection reasons, and the ancient villages of the Middle East usually had walls around them and doors. Nobody, except very wealthy Greco-Roman landowners, nobody lived on their farm. The Middle Easterners themselves lived in villages clear up through the 19th century. So he knows the minute he hits that village street, the people are going to yell at him, and they're going to scream at him, and they're going to tear his clothes, and they're going to slap him, and they're going to insult him. You who went out of here on your big white horse and your fancy ideas. You who sold the orchard of your grandfather. You who thought you were going to make it Mr. Big and leave your father to starve in the village. Take this and take this and take this. He thinks when he gets back to his father's gate, he's going to sit there for quite a while the crowd sort of softens him up a bit. And then finally his father is going to let him back in, and then there's going to be this ghastly scene in which he has to say, of course, Dad, I can't come home, but I'll work as a craftsman if you'll just get me trained, and then years from now he might make it back. But you see, his dad also knows he's not going to make it. And his dad also knows the village is going to be very hard on him. And his dad also knows they will enact the kizaza ceremony. And so his father is watching that road because he wants to see that kid before the kid gets to the village. Now what does the father do? The minute he sees him at yet a great distance, he runs down that village road. Did you ever try and run in a choir robe? The ancient Middle East and much of the Middle East today wears long robes. You can't run in long robes until you pull them up like this. And when you do that in the Middle East, your underwear shows. And the Jews said no man could lift his robes because then his legs show, and this is considered humiliating. And there was even a debate amongst them as to whether or not you dared pull your robes, even if there were thorns beside the path. And some of them said, well, if his robes are going to get caught in thorns, okay, just enough to keep out of the thorns. But now this man, who all his life has walked in the stately pace of a gentleman, because Ben Sirach says, 195 BC in Jerusalem, a gentleman is known by his walk, and those robes kind of flow along behind you and make a magnificent impression. Now this man is running down this street with his robes in his hand, and all the toughs in the street say, look at the funny old...
Okay, what happened?
Steal his nerve.
Okay. All the toughs in the street look at him and say, look at the funny old man with his underwear showing. You did not, as a wealthy landowner, you didn't humiliate yourself like that. This man did in order to get to his son before he could get into close enough where the village could get to him. I don't know what happened to the audio there.
For this confrontation sees the father running the gauntlet for him. He sees the Father in self-emptying love coming to him in a very costly demonstration of unexpected love. And when he sees that, he is broken and distraught. your son. And he is restored by that act of grace before he even gives his speech. And so in its clearest fashion, we see both the incarnation, the Father who comes and becomes a servant, and we see and hear the overtones of the cross. And in its clearest illustration, we find the costly demonstration of totally unexpected love, which melts the socks off of this kid. He now realizes the issue is not the money, and I can work for this man for 1,000,000 years, and I'm not going to make up for the pain of his broken heart. And if it is to be restored, he's going to have to do it, and all I can do is accept it. And that's what he does. And that's what we do. Amen.
Oh my. I just, I hope that's as meaningful and moving to you. And you can watch this over and over again as I have and get more of it each time. So, and these are available to you online if you ever want to watch them again or refer others to them. I'm so thankful for Ken's perspective. So, and that's only the first part of the story. But now, as I brought up in the beginning, Nathan had to find a way to draw David in and for David to condemn the sinner, not knowing that he was actually saying, I'm the one. So once he drew him in, he set him up, and then bam, and David got the point. Jesus drew the Pharisees in with their very piece of, you think you're keeping the law. It's not about the law. You don't think you need help and reconciliation. You think that it needs to have this kind of repentance restoration. And so he's got them saying, hey, he knows what's going on. And then when he gets to the end of this, they're going to see that, yes, the sinner who broke the law needed reconciliation, but the sinners who keep the law. And that's more sophisticated, more nuanced. It's more difficult for us. And how many of us have either played the role or know somebody who has played the role of elder brother, not gender-wise, but in what they've done, and how they have tried to be faithful according to the understandings of how things are supposed to properly be done, and can look at someone who's just been, my goodness, this person didn't even try, and you can get this self-righteous feel, and it blinds us to our own need. My pastor, Tom Babler, that I worked for when I was a youth group director at a Methodist church. Tom Babler, I was privileged to attend the Davidson Clergy Institute with him. He was the elder brother. And his life was partly about coming to grips with that he was the one who towed the line. And he came to understand that in doing so, he looked down upon others in a way that was judgmental. And he was missing his own need for reconciliation and salvation.
I have a story about a girlfriend of mine in Demopolis, Wyoming, and she's my age, and I've known her parents forever. They ran a furniture store in Demopolis, and they've had it for years, ever since I can remember.
Can we move the mic closer to her, please? It doesn't need to be plugged in.
Okay.
Yeah, speak loudly.
Okay, I know.
No, that's fine, yeah.
Okay, so these parents have had their furniture store forever. The father passed away, the mother ran the store. And they had an oldest son, and they had Carolyn, who's my age, and two younger sisters.
The oldest son was my age.
Right, and all the kids are now grown-ups. I mean, they're all adults. And the mother passes away, and she leaves the store to the children. My girlfriend lives in North Dakota, and I know that the oldest brother lived in California, and the two younger girls ran the store to keep tradition going and to keep it going, because the parents worked so hard, and they did. Everybody still, and nothing changed, it was still a productive store. So Carolyn decided, my mom's gone, I want my share of that store. And so she told them, and they couldn't afford to buy her out. So they had to sell the store, period. And so they were no longer having their parents in there. And, you know, I was reading, and anyway, they didn't like Carol at all, of course, you know, because it just wrecked everything. It wrecked their livelihoods, it wrecked the town's livelihood. We only had one furniture store. And we read in the obituary of Charles, the brother, and he goes through how obituaries go, and I have 2 sisters, and I have my parents preceded and never mentioned Carolyn at all, that he even had a sister.
Yeah.
And so talk about being shunned. And she told me this herself personally. She goes, but I had no choice. You know, I'm my age and I want my share, you know? And so, but I mean, it's just like, it's pretty sad, you know, because they could have paid her something along the way or something, you know, not just shut the store down, but she didn't want that.
And sometimes those are some of the most bitter relationship stories we encounter,
Yeah.
are
It
inheritance
was a good
stories.
family.
It was.
And probably all of us know examples of people that we look back and say, boy, you really were missing the whole point of everything here. But it happens repeatedly.
Yes.
And continues to do so in cycles. So this really hits home. And a story like this not only draws the Pharisees in, it draws us in. And so if you find yourself in the shoes of the older brother saying, you know, I would do the same thing, you know, that's just not right. Okay, go with that. But be honest with God. Okay, this is making me angry. How are you going to work this out, God? Don't walk away and say, well, I can't be part of this religion because God's apparently not fair. That's your cynicism driving you away from healing. But instead, use your cynicism to say, okay, God, you know, this is how I honestly feel about this. Let's continue to engage and see what you're going to do with it. So you either walk away or you engage. And I just tell people, yeah, be upset, but engage. Stay engaged.
Well, doesn't it say somewhere, be angry, but do not sin?
Okay, go ahead, Tom.
I think the older brother should have been mad at the mother because she didn't have a will and she didn't specify what she wanted. So the daughter became the butt of the other 3, where if the mother had a lawyer and had spelled out, it wouldn't have happened and the siblings could have gotten along until they compromised. It's hypothetical. But
Yeah.
I didn't see it so much her fault, I saw it the mother's fault.
Right. And the town was very upset.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
especially in a small community.
Yeah, you bet, everybody knows everybody.
Through my lifetime, you see how the family really is, because I've seen, and I'm sure all of you have, of deaths, and then the kids are like vultures.
Oh, yeah.
And then you see what the real family core was.
There's a story in scripture where 2 brothers come to Jesus, like people would do to rabbis, to settle a dispute. I don't remember where it is, we can look it up, but they come to, and they say, settle this dispute between us about dividing the property. Presumably their father has died, and now they're squabbling and arguing about this. And Jesus said, who appointed me arbiter over you? Am I Moses? And in that story, after I learned what Ken teaches here, I was able to preach a sermon on that, saying, Jesus' point was, wake up, you have a brother. You have a relationship, you know, and they miss it because they're squabbling over this stuff. Jesus said, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and these things are fungible, and you can fight over them. Store up relationship treasures, store up treasures in heaven. Wait till we get to the parable of the unjust steward. Oh my goodness. It sounds like Jesus is saying, yeah, be a crook. It's what it sounds like. But the idea, it really brings home this note of, let's look at what's really important, the treasures in heaven, not the treasures on earth. If you are willing, in just the last few minutes here, I have shared my screen and I'm wanting to go to, what is this page number? I don't know if I can get it. Page 10, if you have it, or else watch it on the screen, because I love this, and Ken doesn't cover this directly in the videos. So this is a later piece that he's put together that we can use for reflection. And there are lots of points of cultural misconception in the parable of, and now he's calling it another name, the parable of the compassionate father, the one who he accedes to the request. Okay, I'll divide it among you. You know, when he shouldn't have. He should have insulted his son. And all right, so we have this request, and I think he's put the emphasis on it well. The prodigal's request is an unthinkable breach of traditional culture. He wants his father dead. Number two, his father's gift. The father reprocesses anger into grace. Oh my. And thereby deeply violates the code of the Oriental patriarch, as shown 5 times in the parable. Now, I don't know, we could go through and try and list out where the father doesn't act according to cultural expectation. He gracefully instead reaches out in this costly demonstration of unexpected love. You remember the story of Jesus when the woman who has been caught in adultery is about to be stoned by the crowd, which is, according to the law, their right. Give no mind to the fact that the male wasn't drawn, but so the woman was brought before them to be stoned, and so now they're saying, okay, Rabbi, she has been caught in adultery. The law says she's to be stoned. What do you say? They're very angry at the woman and what she's done, and they're ready to do murder because of it, and they feel righteous about it. And Jesus doesn't say, well, you shouldn't feel righteous about it. Come on, have a little mercy and respect. No, he says, yeah, that's the law. So how about the first one of you that has never committed a sin be the first one to cast a stone? And one by one, thump, 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 the stones drop. But now the people walk away still angry, but not at her. They are angry at Jesus. He has reprocessed the anger into grace. And he has said, I will absorb your anger into my own. Oh, it happens over and over again. So I think it's amazing. We saw the hurried sale, number 3. He triggers the anger of the community, so he's got to get this done quickly. We heard about the kizaza, this threat that if he comes back having lost it to the Gentiles, that's all they need. As soon as he steps foot, as soon as someone sees him, boom, they can get the pot, and there it goes. So the father is scanning the horizon. How many times have I sat with parents who have estranged children for whatever reason? And I say to them, you know the pain of the father. You know the pain of setting up the place at the dinner table every day for years, not knowing if it will ever be filled again. And you scan the figurative horizon for the return. And some parents have the joy of that return and some don't. It's very difficult. But the father is not going to let this happen to his son. He's not going to let him run the gauntlet and be tortured by the community and shunned. The father instead lifts up his robes and he takes the insults and he runs out before they can get to him. He wants to emphasize that it was expensive living, even though the son's later going to say he's wasted it on harlots, and we can read into that how we want. And then he gives some of the language behind there where the word has no hint of immorality. Foolishness, unwise, greedy, whatever, but not the immoral connotation. The search for employment. The prodigal thinks that he must find a paying job to pay back his debt. Not that this is a bad thing, by the way. Remember I said that model of repentance with breaking the window is not a bad thing, and we still encourage that, but not to earn the restoration of relationship with God. Okay, the inauthentic repentance. That's really interesting because it seems authentic to me. But, because he says, I have to go back and say, I have sinned against you. I'm unworthy to be your son. I will do all of this to repay you. Not realizing you can't repay a broken relationship. That's what makes it inauthentic. And so when we want to repent to God by saying, well, I will go to church the rest of my life. I will do this. I will give my firstborn to be a preacher or whatever. It's transactional and we miss the point. Not that those are bad things, But if we do them out of gratitude to serve God rather than out of an obligation to repay God, there's a big difference.
And I don't think I've ever read it and thought of the, I don't think I've ever read it and thought of the prodigal son as coming back and saying, I want you to train me in a craftsman
Yes.
job. I thought, I interpreted it that he was coming back, he was willing to work out in the field, he'd live in a shed, whatever, just like any other servant of the dad. So that was very enlightening that, I want to come back and I want you to train me, but I want you to train me in something that's really a little higher than the guy who's out shoveling the manure out of the pasture or whatever.
And the aspect that when he comes back, he's going to be taking away from his brother. But if he comes back and learns a trade, he can also not do that, not be taken from his brother. These are aspects of the Middle Eastern culture that you would say, if I were reading the Bible on my own and didn't have this, I would never get it. It's true. Thank God we have these kinds of insights through our personal history, experience, people like Ken and many others who can fill us in on the parts we would otherwise miss.
Do you think the reason that Ken doesn't refer to it as prodigal son is because the word prodigal is actually referred to a person who spends money in a recklessly extravagant way, and he didn't want us to focus on what the son had done. He wanted to focus on the relationship of God and man, or the father and son.
I don't think I could speak for Ken on that. It's poignant to me that he at least gives us a refocus by saying the lost younger son and the lost older son. I think it's the fact that he wants to bring out sinners who break the law and sinners who keep the law, whereas the prodigal son, as we've grown up with, kind of focuses on the sinners who break the law. Because I really think that definition of prodigal is right on, someone who wastes with extravagance.
Well, I think back that as a child and young adult and hearing this parable, it was always referred to as the prodigal son. He's the first one to put it in a whole different light. And so I thought, okay, maybe I have the perception wrong of what the meaning of prodigal is. So when I looked it up, I thought, it really does focus on, the spending recklessly, that reaches inheritance. But so it was interesting that he doesn't want to refer to it as that.
The naming of this as the parable of the prodigal son was not an original scripture. It's what grew up out of tradition, which is not bad.
So is that our culture?
It is, well, it's centuries. It goes before Western, it's centuries old. And it's not bad, but we just have to remember there's so many levels that I don't want you to never call this the parable of the prodigal. Keep doing that. That's been beloved. It has taught us over the years. There's lots of good aspects. We just happen now to be expanding on that. So we're not throwing that away. We're adding to it.
Yeah, along that same line, Ken said he wanted his dad to die, and it says that here too, but it doesn't say that anywhere in there. The son is thinking, well, it'd be nice if he does, perhaps, because then I'll get more when I was coming to him. But instead, he asks him, he gets it anyway. The dad simply said, nope, forget it. So I didn't really get the implication when he said he wants his father to die. He didn't say that anyway.
Okay.
Well, one time, this wasn't two brothers or anything like that, but when I was younger, I did surveying back in Ohio, and we went out to survey 2 to 5 acres. A father was giving, I believe, only one son, that's the only one I saw, these 2 to 5 acres out on the farm. And I was right there, and the boy, probably my age at the time, I'll say 28, he looked at his dad and he said, I don't like that. And he said, well, I don't know if I'll give you something else. And the boy said, Dad, I'll just wait till you die. And I heard that, saw that right there. So that would have been right at the moment, good old Dad would have said, no, you're out of the well.
I'll give you $1. I don't think I'd have said it. I think I would have just gone in and fixed the well and not said.
Do we think
about it, let him find it at the end.
the the reason that he refers to the father's death, and it was why it was so hurtful,
Mhm.
is because in their culture, you didn't talk about inheritance
Mhm.
unless the inheritance was after the fact.
Yeah.
So for a child to bring up the inheritance,
Mhm.
culturally, it meant that you wanted,
Yeah.
you perceive,
Mhm.
you can't wait for your father to die.
Yeah.
It was-
You know,
yes.
and even to this day, especially in Middle Eastern culture, but elsewhere too, that would be considered a terrible breach.
Well, I even think if I would have talked about that with my mom and dad, I would have felt that it was very unkind. I mean, I didn't want to think about them dying,
Yeah.
you know, and to think, well, mom and dad, what are you gonna do with, you know, you ever thought about what you're gonna do? That just seemed really cold-blooded.
Well, I remember once talking with my parents, how we got started on it, I don't know. This was a teenager or so. And I told them I want them to live forever. I don't want anything that they have,
Yeah.
just as long as they're in good health.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's what I said, and I remember that.
Mhm.
The only thing I remember is my mom was from a family of 9, and it was very difficult because when Papa and Mama passed away, they didn't have anything specifically written down, so the kids had to pretty well. So if it's a table of, you know, the big table was say at 12 because there were so many kids, so each child got 1 chair. And it was like, I remember my mom said, you know, I just think Papa and Mama, if they would have thought that through, they would have seen the table and chair goes to 1 child, you know?
Yeah.
And the only thing my parents said is that they just wanted to make sure that, that the children remembered that it was a gift from my mother and daddy, you know, that it wasn't any one of ours. Whatever we got, it was a gift, but not to fight over it. That would, you know, be hurtful, yeah.
I owe you all at least 5 minutes because I started late, and I'm going to just finish points 8 through 11 here. The turning point is the costly demonstration of unexpected love. The father runs out. This is interesting if you want to look this up. A father who behaves like a mother. Where did that show up in here? Well, by referring to Hosea 11. I believe in Hosea 11, what is being said by the prophet is God speaking to Israel that has basically been like an unfaithful wife. And God, as Hosea, has every right to kizaza or whatever, bury the son, bury the child. God has every right to do that. And so Hosea shows God as having a quandary over this. It's a very Jewish understanding of God. God has the right to do this, but look, he so loves. And what does God say to Israel? How can I enact the punishment you deserve? I taught you to walk. I fed you at my breast. You are my child. So Hosea says, even though God has every right to condemn and shun, God has this inner love that says, but you are mine. You are the one I suckled. I can't go through with this. So it's very, very, the authentic repentance, well, he stops his speech, according to Ken. I am unworthy to be called your son. And then he doesn't go on and say, fashion me out of craftsmen. He's seen what his father's done. He understands that there's no way I can repay this back. He is reaching out. All I can do is accept the embrace. And so that's the authentic. And lastly, part of what Ken would be now emphasizing with his Muslim friends, there is Christology in this. Jesus is speaking of his own role. He's speaking of the need of the Pharisees. Sure, sinful humanity needs, but also the people who don't think they need saving. And Christology, again, is the study of the person and work of Christ. What does Christ's coming mean? How does it get accomplished? The rest of it goes on to the next part of the parable, so we can stop there. But to me, this is a rich feast. I hope you're finding it to be that way as well. Okay, and I'll stop the recording. I'll offer a prayer and thank you for your patience with all the extra time.